In the last video, we talked about the Enlightenment, its main ideals, and how it impacted predominantly women and also slavery. But we kind of looked at the ideas of popular sovereignty, the social contract, division of powers, and the ideals behind that, and the ideas between moving too slowly with moving slower with conservatism and moving quicker with liberals and liberalism. All right. So now that brings us to the French Revolution. All right. So we'll see how many videos this takes. Hopefully, we'll take one. We'll see. But yeah, so the French Revolution is a very long movement that begins, I should say the actual revolution begins in 1789, it has its beginnings before that with Enlightenment ideals, and has very long-lasting effects. So it's a movement that is about changing the political, social, and cultural fabric of France itself, and with, again, mixed long-term results in that, often between what would be the nobility versus the middle and lower classes. So some of the history here. So remember we talked about France being essentially an absolute monarchy. And while there is a legislative body, it only meets whenever the king requests it. All right. And inside of France's kind of economic and political structure or social structure, there's, three groups of people. Okay. So you have over here the estate system. So the first estate is essentially that is the clergy. That is the Catholic Church. The second estate is the nobility, the aristocracy, and as we know, that power has actually been limited anyway, as we talked about, the evolution of the French monarchy with, Louis XIV, building of Versailles, things of that nature, that the monarch or the nobles and the aristocrats have kind of, really lost power and influence, but they're still granted the ability to be tax exempt. And still receive, payments and things of that nature from, people that work their land or that they oversee, things of that nature. So there's still a lot of advantages to being an aristocrat at this point within France. So only the commoners, the people in that third class, so lawyers, doctors, farmers, artisans, day laborers, things of that nature, they're the ones who pay and prop up the taxes for all of France, which has been increasing. So obviously the building of Versailles put France into a lot of debt, and then France has always been has been constantly at war for a long time. But more recently, fought in the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War or War for Empire, from 1756 to 1763, which they lost, which also included a lot of territory they lost to Britain, both in the Americas, but also in other places around the globe. Then they got involved in the American Revolution. All right, because they figured this is a good way to get back at the British by having them lose one of their biggest colonies or group of colonies, and we know that that is very successful. And so France invests and gives money and loans to the American people for the movement, but also supplies troops and ships and supplies for the war effort, because the United States does not win, at least not quickly or as fast as it happened, and it wasn't a quick war anyway, but the Americans do not win without the aid of the French. So that builds and balloons the debt that they have to deal with. But at the same time, you also now see rising stuff within less than a decade later of a struggle in terms of increased food prices, food shortages, and growing unemployment throughout the countryside. So a lot of people are upset and angry. So Louis XVI, this is Louis XIV, by the way, Louis XVI wants to essentially try and pay off the debts and get everyone back to work. And so what he wants to do is raise taxes, but he knows he can't really get it from the third estate. So what he wants to do is raise it on the second estate, again, the nobility. And so he calls in 1789 the Estates General, which is the meeting of all three of these states to pay off the actual debts. But the nobility say, yeah, no. And so part of that is there's a big problem with it. Every estate essentially gets a very large amount of numbers to go do this, but each member or each group only gets one vote. So only one vote for all of the members of the third estate, only one vote for the nobles, and one vote for the clergy. And the clergy, often tied in with the nobility and the aristocrats, pretty much say, yeah, no, we're not voting in favor of that, or we are going to refuse to do so, even though the third estate would definitely like some help. So during this time when they are meeting at Versailles, under the the ideas under the watchful eye of King Louis XVI and his people, in the Third Estate that summer in July forms a new national government as a result, because there are riots that are starting to happen throughout Paris and other parts of France. Fearing this that nothing is going to change. And so they meet here in this little tennis court area, and you can see the hundreds of people. And so they decide we're going to form a new government called the National Assembly. And this is sort of the beginning of the revolution. And so they declare, or they kind of write up a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is similar to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, to limit the powers of the monarchy, essentially creating a constitutional monarchy, which the king and the monarchy won't really have a whole lot of power. Limit the nobles and their rights, their privileges, their powers. Don't give them any say in the legislature. And also to limit the powers of the church by getting rid of their tax-exempt status and to essentially try and end feudalism. So this would put more of the people in the third estate in power of the government in order to protect their rights, including the freedom of religion, protect a lot of their social rights, and getting more equality for the average French male is kind of the idea. So during the same time, you have here the famous storming of the Bastille, but you also have other armed insurrections again done in order to support the National Assembly and out of fear that the National Assembly might be put down. At the same time that this is going on, and also throughout early parts of the French Revolution, you have people going into the homes of the nobles who they might have owed money to, owed debts or other types of debts to, and they go in and essentially light on fire the records of the debts and the actual orders of payments and things of that nature to essentially kind of erase the debt as you would. So as you can see, there is the beginnings of a social, economic, and political revolution going on in France in 1789. Okay, now, during the next few years, as the National Assembly turns into, I believe it's called like the National Convention, it goes through so many phases within such a short period of time and so many different forms of government. But in 1792, the revolution takes a more radical turn and becomes, I believe, about 1793, 1794, known as the Reign of Terror. So they change governments once again because many of the nobles have been leaving France. They're fearing for their safety. They are losing their rights. And they do not like the changes. Obviously, when you're in power and you're now losing it, why would you want that change? Why would you be okay with it? So many of the nobles now are fleeing to other European countries, and the other European countries are going like, we don't really like this either, with all these, common folk, rising up and, essentially taking away the power of the nobility, the power of the monarchs. That's some scary stuff. So the nobles help the Europeans, other European powers, including Britain, Prussia, Russia, Spain, the Austro-Hungarians, the Habsburg monarchy, known as the Austro-Hungarians, like they all start declaring war on France, and France itself is now feeling, okay, our revolution is threatened by the nobility, by these outside forces, and also by the monarchy, who they had essentially allowed to leave, and they had left in power, and the monarchy. King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette had been under sort of house arrest. They had tried running away once. Women of France during a bread riot had actually broken into I don't know if it was Versailles or it was the Tuileries, which is like the palace in the city of Paris. They broke into one of them and pretty much held the king at not gunpoint but like knife point at one point. They were okay, but there was conspiracy that he was trying to overthrow the revolution, and so this actually does end up building a nationalist idea, and we'll talk about nationalism in a few, in a video when we talk actually about nationalism. That starts to form because now there's this French identity. We're protecting the French people, the French idea of revolution, to do so, and when they do that, they end up killing, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette for the conspiracy to stop the revolution. So to deal with these internal and external threats, like I said, they begin this new form of government. I again don't remember what it's called because there's so many of them. They begin to essentially convict and find guilty of and guillotining. By the way, that's an actual verb. I typed it in. When you put someone to the guillotine, you can verbiage that into guillotining. So they feel that those they oppose or who oppose them, the revolutionary movement, or don't fully support the revolution or might betray it, are essentially considered enemies of the state and are okay to kill. About 40,000 of them is believed to have been killed in some way, shape, or form, mostly through the guillotine. There's the image. in 1 year between 1793 and 1794, including a lot of the revolution's most radical leaders at this time, because it was thinking that they were going too far, or they weren't radical enough, or they weren't going to protect it enough. And there's a lot of people, a lot of things involved here, but again, we don't have to go into specifics for our understanding. So then conservatives were able to take control by 1794, and then Napoleon Bonaparte takes over in 1799 and declares himself emperor in 1802. So they were trying to find kind of a more middle path of the revolution, the more moderate path to take on. So Napoleon, as I said, he takes charge. He is this, military leader of the French army and has won a lot of battles. He's also lost a few battles, specifically in Egypt. But essentially, he's kind of risen into power. And so he offers France political stability by making himself essentially the emperor of the French Revolution and the French government. So some of the stuff he does, he makes peace with the Catholic Church. He creates the Napoleonic Code, which we'll take a look at here in a sec, because that has lasting impacts throughout Europe, and continues to try and focus on moderate changes of the revolution with the ideas of social equality. But he restricts freedom of speech and of the press, because anyone that spoke out against him he viewed as an enemy to himself and what he would deem as the revolution. So some of the things that he brings in, the idea of a national bank, similar to what the United States had started with, to oversee an actual currency in France, to again unite people, so centripetal forces, making sure every male is equal before the law, again, ending feudal privileges and rights, so again, everyone is supposed to be on equal playing fields, increase in public education, so including high schools, universities, tech schools, continuing to push for religious toleration, are things that obviously continue that. But Napoleon also is after land and power, so he's consistently fighting throughout Europe, which will, as we'll see, reshape the political structure of Europe in the long run. But he is eventually defeated because he overextends himself. He has a lot of enemies, the British being one of them, Russia being another. And so in 1815, after Napoleon is finally defeated, the monarchy is restored. So it's kind of like, what was the point of this, long, 25-ish year, almost 25, 26-year-ish revolutionary phases of all this stuff? What does that accomplish if we ended up putting the same monarchs or their descendants back on the throne? So what did it achieve if they're all there, other than all these people being dead and a waste of time and money and land? Well, a lot of these things do persist. The religious toleration in France, which we had seen, continues. France now does actually have a constitutional monarchy, and it stays that way, with the monarch not really having a whole lot of power, and that will kind of vary because France will go through a few more revolutions. The feudal system doesn't really return, so nobles are able to come back, but again, their rights and privileges are essentially gone. Capitalism becomes really, really big in France, as we'll see with the Industrial Revolution. Individual rights, including equality under the law, fair taxes, public education, will remain, and we will now begin to see nationalism continue to spread throughout Europe and other parts of the world. So there are going to be lasting implications for this on a global scale. So here's France's revolution in 1789 with, this little purple border, and then areas that they continue to add. A lot of it do, especially here in, Italy, thank you to Napoleon. So they even add in, Belgium, parts of, what is nowadays Germany, all these territories they continue to add. 1797, we can skip that one. But yeah, here's 1812. He's added all this, and here's the Empire of France. They've conquered Holland. They've essentially reestablished or completely changed the organization, as we'll see, within what we consider to be modern-day Germany, and essentially made states ally with him, including Prussia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He is marrying off his relatives, and he married into power, and he set up his brothers and his families on the thrones throughout much of Europe that he could conquer. So kind of here was Europe before, particularly again within the idea of Germany. That completely changes, and like I said, we'll set this tone. And then we will in the next video talk about the Congress of Vienna and the idea of nationalism. So again, just kind of a one-step connection as we're taking small things around with how the Enlightenment affects different parts of the world. So next up is going to be Europe as a whole after the French Revolution.